it's time to move on. You folks did a really nice job of diving into narrative poems, okay? Some of you said that you were kind of intimidated by poetry when we started, but all of you said that the narrative poem was no longer intimidating for you. Not all of you who said you were intimidated to start with. Some of you were familiar with poetry, of course, right from the beginning, so that there was nothing new about it. But you all got the idea that narrative poetry tells a story, and many narrative poems can tell a story and also get inside us. So you did it, as usual, you did a terrific job, both on your essays and on your comments. So, overall, you guys are just knocking the ball out of the park week after week after week. I hope we get a chance late in the semester to actually get together, because I would really love to meet all of you. So I hope we can arrange that maybe next week. I'll start to talk a little bit more about that, okay? But anyway, for now, narrative poetry, you seem to have a very good handle on the idea that narrative poetry tells us a story, okay? Lyric poetry is the next kind of poetry that we are looking at, okay? So narrative poetry tells a story. Does that mean that lyric poetry doesn't tell a story? It doesn't really mean that. There can be a story to it. But let me read you a brief definition of lyric poetry to help you kind of get the idea of what it's all about, okay? It calls it a brief, subjective poem strongly marked by imagination, melody, and emotion, and creating for the reader a single unified impression. So, that's kind of what it's about. And actually, lyric poems in particular were written to be put to music. It says the history of the lyric poem in English started almost with the beginnings of our literature. So lyric poems have been around a long time, okay? And again, they are meant really to get inside us, to appeal to our emotions, to have a poet kind of ring a bell inside us so that our emotions can be struck somehow. So that it's more than just, somebody trying to write a poem that sounds pretty. Lyric poems frequently do sound pretty because, the melody to them is nice and all that. All that being said, it's still important for you to read lyric poems the same way that we talked about reading narrative poems, by the punctuation, okay? That doesn't mean completely ignore the rhyme, because sometimes the rhyme adds to the emotion, but we're not delving into that. We're really delving into what this kind of poetry is all about. Yeah, my cuckoo clock is going off here. It's pretty appropriate for me. My wife calls me that name kind of frequently. But anyway, okay, so lyric poetry, how do you read it? Again, you read it much the same way. You may have to read things twice, but what's important is that you don't close up your mind, you don't close up your emotions when you start to read it. You really need to kind of try to free yourself from the world around you and just kind of get to where you can read the poems. And they will probably be meaningful to you even more quickly if you read the poems out loud to yourself, because poetry is meant not only to be read, but to be heard, okay? So if you can, get someplace where you can read the poem out loud to yourself. If somebody wants to read the poem to you, that's not a bad thing either, but their reading of it may cause you to be sucked into their interpretation, and we're looking for you to relate personally to the poem. Kind of the same way we did in narrative poetry, except that, again, now we're moving to a large part away from the story in the poem and into what emotions can be stirred by these different kinds of poems. Lyric poems are usually short, and pretty much all the ones that we're talking about this week are pretty short. They can take us in a lot of different directions, but of course our emotions can take us in a lot of different directions, okay? I strongly encourage you to see if there's a way that you can somehow relate to what's being said in the poem. In the narrative poems, you did a really good job of saying, this reminded me of, like a couple of people talked about Casey at the bat, and one person talked about when she played high school softball. Another person talked about when she played high school basketball. It's that same kind of tension in sports because, sports is a large part a reflection of life, and most things in life have a certain amount of anxiety connected with them. Sports certainly does, so, that's part of what a poem like Casey at the Bat does, and that's really what these people were reminded of, besides the fact that that poem was so much fun, and, Sam McGee, actually somebody chose to write about Sam McGee because they were doing their paper on that day last week when it was snowing, and it just seemed so appropriate to them, which certainly it was. Fortunately, that snow didn't stick, at least not anywhere that I was aware of. It may have way down in the hills, I don't know, but I'm in Orchard Park and it didn't stick to us here. Anyway, so lyric poems are meant to get inside us, inside our head, inside our heart, inside of who we are, and the best way to really get something out of a lyric poem is, in a sense, to see if there's some way that this poem applies to you, if the meanings in the poem can somehow apply to you, okay? So let me give you the poems that are on our list for this week, and actually two of them are poems that were on last week, because two of the poems that we listed as narrative certainly also can be cranking with the emotions, so I feel like both of these poems are lyric poems as well as being narrative poems. And so even if you wrote about them last week as a narrative poem, I have no problem with you writing about them this week as a lyric poem. So this is our list, The Death of the Turret Ball Gunner. That was on the list last week. But when you think about that poem, there's such a human element to it. It's on page 574 in your book. The turret is the thing on the back of planes in World War II where a guy sat with a machine gun and it was glass enclosed. And of course, he was trying to shoot other planes out of the sky. In the meantime, the other planes in the sky were shooting first at him, to try to take out that machine gun. And so it was probably the worst place to be on an airplane, and these guys got killed pretty frequently. But there is tremendous emotion in the way that this poem comes together in the end. I mean, emotion because you might see it as almost totally unemotional with the way it comes together in the end. It's I don't know. It's an amazing poem. So, Death of the Turret Ball Gunner on 574. We've already talked some about Richard Cory, but there's lots of ways to talk about this, and you might look at that from an emotional standpoint too. That's on 647. Then a couple of poems. Let's see, some poems that are really pretty well known. One is a poem about making decisions and how those decisions can affect your life, and all of you can probably relate to this because all of you made significant decisions to be in college right now, okay? There were other paths that you could have taken. The name of that poem is The Road Not Taken, and it's page 792. And again, all of you took a road, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and being one traveler long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps a better claim. So, two roads diverged. He looked down one as far as he could. Didn't know where it went. Took the other road. And it ends with, and that has made all the difference. So it's a poem about making decisions. It's on page 792. It's a Robert Frost poem. And of course, Robert Frost is a poet that everybody knows. Another Robert Frost poem is the poem Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. That's on page 800. Okay. When I go through these, I'll ask you to grab a pencil and paper after I get done going through them all, and then I'll repeat the names of all the poems and the pages they're on, okay? But Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. When you read that poem, think about dark forests, okay? That should ring a bell for you, because we encountered a dark forest not real long ago, and everything that connects with dark forests. So you might want to bring that into your consideration. Another poem, Mending Wall, is a pretty well-known poem, and it ends with a really powerful finishing line. It really is good. And then there's another poem that all of you who have ever experienced love should be able to relate to. It's by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and the name of the poem is How Do I Love Thee? It's on page 934. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was married to Robert Browning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was actually confined to a wheelchair her whole life. She and Robert Browning met through letters to each other, got together, got married. Okay, and so she writes this beautiful poem as a tribute to her husband. But again, all of you who have known love should be able to relate to that poem too. There's so much emotion. So again, the poems Death of the Turret Ball Gunner on 574, Richard Cory on 647, The Road Not Taken on 792, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening on page 800, Mending Wall on page 795, How Do I Love Thee on page 934, okay? And your question for this week is a poem that you know and like that you would consider a lyric poem, okay? So email me the answer to that question, okay? A poem that you would consider a lyric poem. Have a good week. You know where to get in touch with me. You guys are doing amazing stuff.